Welcome to part 29 of our series on building a Zelda-like game in Phaser 3. Now that we have doors in place, it's time to handle smooth room transitions. In this video, we'll create a system for detecting when the player enters a new room and adjust the camera and game state accordingly. If you're new here, this is part of a full series where we create a Zelda-inspired game from scratch. Check out the playlist link in the description to start from the beginning. Alright, let's dive in and implement room transitions. So now for our handle room transition method, once our player collides with our zone game object, we'll want to start off by disabling our arcade physics body on our door. We'll then want to grab a reference to the target door that this door is connected to, and then do the same thing for that arcade physics body. This way, once our player triggers our callback method one time, we'll stop invoking it until our player's in the next room and safely away from the door that we just exited from. Now, based on our player's current position and then the target door we want to move our player to, we'll need to figure out how far to move our player into our next room and in which direction. So as an example, when we're exiting from room 1 down to room 2, we know when we go through this door, our other door is going to be at the top of our screen, and so we need to update our player's Y value, and we need to keep increasing it until our player's through our door. Now in our other rooms, if we try to go to the right and we're exiting through the right, we know our door will be on the other side, and so we'll need to update our X value. So once we figure out which position we need to move our player to, we'll need to animate our player to that position. At the same time, we'll want to update our camera to follow our player, and then update our camera's bounds to be in the new position of the new room. Once we finish with all this animations and we get our player into the new room, we can re-enable our trigger on our door game objects. That way our player will be able to go back and forth. To get started with our changes, first let's grab a reference to our door and our target door based on our door name that was provided here. So let's do const, we'll do door. We're going to set this equal to our objects by room ID. We want to grab our current room ID, our door map, and now we'll do our door trigger and our name property. And we'll type this as door, and now for our target door, this will be equal to our objects by room ID. We'll want to use the door that we found, and we want to do the target room ID. Now we'll do our door map again, and now we want to do our door, and then our target door ID. Now that we have our references to our two doors, we can disable our game objects. So we'll do our door, we'll do disable object, and we'll do the same thing for our target door. So now to figure out where we need to animate our player to, we need to figure out which direction our target door is from our current door. And so if our target door is down from our current door, we know we need to update our Y value and increase it, versus if it was up, we'd want to decrease it, and then left and right, we want to update our X value. Now to figure out the direction of our current door compared to our target door, we're going to make a new utility function. So let's go into our utils file. We'll do export function, and for our function name, we're going to call this get direction of object from another object. So now for our function, we need to compare our X and Y coordinates of our two game objects and then return a direction based on those values. Now we want this to be generic, so for our object, we're just going to type this to be of type position. Then that way, as long as our game object has an X and Y, we can pass it in. And so now we'll do our target object. We'll also want our type to be position, and now we're going to return a direction from our function. So we'll just compare our X and Y values. So if our object at Y is less than our target object.Y, then we know the direction is down. Next, we'll check to see if it's greater than, then the direction will be up. Now we'll check our X value, and so if our X is less than our target X, then we know the direction of the target door is right. And then finally, if that's not true, then our direction must be left. Now that we have our new function, we'll jump back to our game scene. So let's make a new variable to store this new value. So we'll do const, we'll do target direction. We're going to set that equal to our get direction from object. And now we'll do our door, and we want to do our target door. Now that we have our target direction, we need to figure out how far we actually need to move our player from this room into our next room. For this animation, we're going to do it in 2 steps. First, we're going to update our player's position to disappear into our hallway, so halfway between our two doors, and then we're going to animate our player into our next room. By breaking this up, it's going to help us create a transition for our camera, and then we get a nice smooth transition as our player moves between our rooms. So now to calculate that position, let's make a new object. We'll do const, we'll do door distance. We're going to set it equal to an object. For our X and Y values, we want to compare our X and Y position of our door transition zone and our target door transition zone. And since we only want to move our player halfway between here and their target location, we'll want to divide it by 2. While working with both of these properties, we're going to use the absolute values so we make sure they're positive. And so we'll do math, we'll do absolute. And now let's take our door. We want to do our door transition zone, our X value. We want to subtract our target door, our door transition zone, our X value, and now we want to divide it by 2. Now we want to do the same thing for our Y value. And so for our property, we'll do Y, but now we'll use our Y values from both these game objects. And so since both of these are positive, now we need to check our target direction and then multiply by -1 if we need to decrease our player's value. So we'll do if our target direction is equal to our direction up, then we want to take our door distance, our Y property, and we want to multiply this by -1. And we'll want to do the same thing if our direction's left, and then we'll do our X value. Now that we have our distance we need to move, we can create a tween to update our player's position. So first we'll make a variable to store our target position we want to move our player to, and so we're going to call this player target position. We're set that equal to an object. So now for our player's target position, for our X value, we want to take our door's X value, and we want to put our player in the middle, so we'll add in our width, and then divide it by 2. We'll then want to add on our door distance that our player needs to travel, so then that way our player will be somewhere in our hallway here. For our Y value, we'll want to do something similar, where we take our Y position, and then subtract our height, so then that way we'll be in the center, and then we'll also want to increase our height, we'll also want to increase our Y value, so our player moves down. So to do that, let's take our door, we'll do our X, we're going to add our door transition zone, we'll divide it by 2, now we'll add in our door distance, and we'll do our X value. And then we'll do our door transition zone, and we want our width. Let's copy this, and we'll do our Y value. And so for our Y, we'll do our door Y, our door transition height, and then we'll add in our Y position. And then we actually want to subtract our height, so then that way we put us in the middle of our door. Now that we have our target position, we can create our tween to animate our player. So we'll do this, we'll do our tween, so let's do add. So now for our tween, we want to target our player. For our Y value, this is going to be our player target position, and then our Y property. Now for our X, same thing, but with our X property. Now for our duration, let's do 750 milliseconds, and we'll do a small delay, and we'll do 250 milliseconds. All right, so if we refresh, we can test our changes. Let's have our player come down to our door. As soon as they overlap with our door trigger, we start our animation for moving our player down between our 2 doors. For our next part of our animation, we want to start updating our camera to move from our current room to our next room. For this to work, we have to reset our camera's bounds. Otherwise, we won't be able to have our camera scroll from this room to our next. So we'll start off by doing this. We'll do our cameras. We'll do main. We're going to call set bounds. Now for our bounds, we just want to reference our world's X, Y, and width properties. So then that way we can have our camera move in any direction we need it to move. So we'll do this. We'll do our cameras. Let's do our main. We'll do our world view. We'll do our X value. I'm going to copy this. We'll paste it 3 times. Now we want to do our Y, and now we want to do our width and our height. After we reset our camera's bounds, now we want to create a tween animation to move our camera. For our animation, we don't want to target our camera directly. Instead, we'll want to update our camera's bounds. By updating our camera's bounds instead of our X and Y properties directly, it's going to allow us to shift our camera in the direction we need it to go without it leaving our currently defined space for our rooms. And so to create this type of animation, we need to have a property we can animate. And so to do that, let's make a new variable, do const, we'll do bounds. We're going to set it equal to this, our cameras, our main camera, and now we're going to call getBounds. Now this method is going to return a copy of our bounding rectangle so we can modify it without affecting our camera. Once we have this rectangle, now we can update it as part of our tween configuration, and then we'll use that to reset our camera's bounds. So let's do this, we'll do our tweens, let's do add. For our configuration, we want to target that bounding rectangle, and now we want to target its X and Y values. For these, we want to grab our X and Y values and base these off of our target room. So very similar to what we did when we updated our camera initially for our bounding area. So we'll want to grab our target room, and then we can update our X and Y values very similar to what we did here. So I'm going to copy this line of code from setup camera. We'll come back down here. And so we'll just add that code before our tween configuration. So instead of targeting our current room ID, we want to use our target door and then grab our room ID from that object. So down in our tween configuration, we can do our room size.x. For our y, we'll do our room size.y, and we'll subtract our room size height. And now for our duration and our delay, we'll do 1000 milliseconds for our duration, and we'll do 500 for our delay. And so now to reset our camera's bounding box while this is happening, we want to use our onUpdate property. And so what onUpdate does, this allows us to provide a callback function that can be invoked between every step of our tween animation. When this runs, we'll reset our camera's bounds, and we want to set it to our bounds rectangle here. So I'm going to copy this here, we'll paste it, but now we want to update our reference, and so we'll do our bounds.x. And we want to do the same thing for our x, our y, and our width and our height. Finally, for our camera animation, the last thing we'll do is before we start our tween animation, we want to have our camera stop following our player. We're going to do this, we'll do our cameras, we'll do main, we'll do stop follow. And once we get our player into our next room, we'll reset our camera to follow our player. Alright, so if we want to test our changes, let's come into our browser. If we have our player interact with our door, we now have this very nice, smooth transition where our camera is going to move from our previous room to our new room. So just to recap what we did here, we started off by resetting our bounds for our camera. So after we reset our bounds on our camera, we now want to update it to be the bounding box of our next room. That way our player will be able to navigate around that room without our camera leaving it. However, we don't want to set this right away, otherwise what would happen is our camera is going to snap to that next location, and we won't have this nice transition. And so to see an example of this, let's come up to where we set up our camera. Let's copy our line of code here where we set our bounds on our camera. Let's come back down to our method, we'll paste that outside our tween, and let's comment out our tween. So now what we're doing is after we have our camera stop following our player, we reset our bounds on our camera to be equal to the new bounds on the new room we're moving to. Now what should happen is after our player transitions to our door, we immediately snap to that new view, and it's really jarring for the player. And so to avoid that jarring experience, we can use a tween. With the tween, we can tween between our bounding box's current X and Y values and animate them to our target position we want to move to. So that's what we did here. First, we grabbed our X and Y value from our current bounding box, and then for our target, we provided our updated X and Y based on our bounds of our target room we want to move to. And so then now by adding in that tween, we get this nice smooth animation where our camera now moves down to our next room. The last thing we need to add for our room transition animation is while we're updating our camera's bounds so we transition to our next room, we also need to update our player's position. After our player enters our room, we're going to use that as our trigger to re-enable our collision check between our player and our door trigger. We'll also use that to update our camera to start having it follow our player again. To add in this tween configuration, we first need to calculate how far our player needs to move from our off-screen position here into our room. To figure that out, let's make a new variable. We'll do const. We'll do player distance to move into room. We're going to set that equal to an object, and then we'll have our X and Y values. So we're going to take our door distance variable. We'll take our X property, we're going to multiply by 2, and we'll do the same thing for our Y value. So for the distance our player needs to move into our room, we want to make sure that this value is enough to make sure we always clear our door entrance. Otherwise, what could happen is if this value is small enough, our player could end their position while still standing on our door trigger. What this would do is it would then trigger our player to now go back into our other room, and we don't want that. And so to make sure we always move at least this minimum distance, we're going to use math.max. So first we're going to check our target direction. So we'll do our target direction. And so if our target direction is equal to direction.up, or it's down, then we know we need to modify our Y value. So we'll take our player distance to move into room. We'll take the Y property. We're going to set equal to our math. We're going to do max. And now we're going to do our absolute value to make sure we're working with positive numbers. So we'll do absolute value, and we'll do our player distance into room, Y. And now we're going to compare this to 32. And so by doing this, whatever this value is, we'll make sure it's always positive, and whichever of these two is greater, we're going to take that value. So if this is 16, we'll make sure we at least move 32 pixels. If this is 64, we would move 64 pixels. Now, if we're moving our upwards direction, we want to make sure our Y value is going to be negative. So we're just going to take this and we're going to multiply it by -1. And so we'll just do if our target direction is equal to direction up, then we just want to multiply this by -1. And now we just want to do the similar logic for our other directions. So I'm just going to copy this logic here. We'll do our else block. And now we just want to do our X property. And now if our player is moving left, we want to multiply our X value by -1. Now that we've calculated our distance we want to move, now we can create our tween to finish animating our player. So we're going to do this. We'll do our tweens. Let's do add. Now for our configuration, let's target our player. Now for our X and Y value, we're going to use our player target position.x. Now for our properties, let's do our Y property. So we're going to take our player target position and our Y value, and now we're going to increment it by our player distance to move into room, our Y value. We'll copy that. We're going to do the same thing for our X value. So now for our duration, let's do 1000 milliseconds. And for our delay, we'll do 1200 milliseconds. Next, we'll add in our onComplete callback. So now in our callback, we want to re-enable our target door so we can trigger our collision. So we'll do our target door. Let's do enable object. Now we'll want to update our current room our player is in. So we'll do this. Our current room ID will be equal to our target door and the room that that door belongs to. We want to update our camera. So we'll do this.cameras.main, start to follow, and we want to follow our player again. All right, so now if we save, let's come back over to our browser. All right, so if we test our changes, now we should be able to have our player come down into our room. After our player enters our room, we should be able to go back up, and our camera should follow our player back into that room. All right, so with our changes, our player should be able to navigate our dungeon through our various rooms. All right, so we'll do one more quick test. We're going to come to our last dungeon room, which is larger than our other rooms, and we want to make sure our transition's working properly. Oh, so it looks like we have an issue. So after our player enters this room, our camera transitions to the top of the room instead of focusing on our player. Now to fix our bug with our last room transition, let's come up to our logic for our tween where we update our camera's bounds. Oh, so when we do call set bounds, we don't want to call our bounds.width and our bounds.height. We want to reset this to be our room size and use that width and height. All right, so now if we save, let's come back to our browser. Let's navigate to our last room. Alright, so now when we enter our last dungeon room, now our camera bounds should match where our player enters through our door, and it should follow our player as we move up through our level. Nice. So one other thing we'll want to do when our player's transitioning through our rooms is after we start our transition, we want to lock our player input. Otherwise what can happen is our player's transitioning, they can keep pressing our arrow keys and it's going to move our player around. Instead, we want our player to stay facing the direction until they get into the next room, and then we'll give control back to our player. To add support for this, we're going to enhance our input component, and we're going to add a new property to indicate if our movement should be locked for our player. To do this at the top of our class, let's add a new property. We're going to call this isMovementLocked. We'll make this a Boolean. Now for our default value, we're going to set it equal to false. Let's update our reset method to also reset our property. And now let's add in our getter and setter for this property. So we'll do get isMovementLocked. This will return our Boolean. So we'll return this and then our private property. I'm going to copy this. We'll do our setter. So we'll do set. We won't have a return type. And now we'll have our value, and this will be our Boolean. Now we'll just set our private property to that value. So now back over in our game scene. So now in our handle room transition method, let's lock our input. So we're going to do this. We'll do our controls. We'll do isMovementLocked. We'll set it equal to be true. Let's copy that line of code. Let's come down to the bottom of our method. And after we reset our camera, let's re-enable our input so our player should be able to move around. Finally, we just need to update our state for our player movement so we won't allow movement when our input's locked. To do that, let's go into our baseMoveState class in our isNoInputMovement method. Alright, so in our method, if any of these are true, Or if our movement is locked, then we don't want to allow movement. So now we're going to do or. So we'll do our controls and we'll do is movement locked. Alright, so we save. Let's come back to our browser. Let's try testing. Try having our player move through our room. Oh, looks like we can still provide input. So now let's take a look at our move state class. So in our move state class, after we do our check for is no movement, yes, we just need to add in our return statement so we don't process the rest of our code inside our method here. So now if we come back to our scene, let's try having our player move. Now we'll see we can't provide our input, and then once our player's back in the room, we give them control over their player again. Much better. And just to double check, let's open up our move holding state. And we also need to add in our return statement there. Now let's save. So now for our room transition logic, the last thing we'll do is we're going to move our properties here for our duration and delay for our various tweens into our config file. So let's go into our config file. All right, so let's make a new variable, do export const. And for our variable name, we're going to do room transition. And we'll do player into hall duration. We'll set that equal to our 750 milliseconds. Let's copy that. Now we'll do our delay. For that, there'll be 250 milliseconds. Now let's copy both of those. We'll paste them. Now we're going to do our room transition player into next room. So I'm just going to copy that part of our string. We'll replace hall. Now for our values, we'll do 1000 and then our 1200. Finally, we just need to add our two properties for our camera. So let's copy that. We'll paste it. Now we'll do our room transition and we'll do our camera animation duration. I'm going to copy that and then we'll do our delay. So now we'll have our 1000 milliseconds and then our 500. All right, so now we just need to update our game scene. Let's come up to our imports and we're just going to import our whole object from our config file. So we're going to do import as our config. Now we'll need to update our references in our code. So we'll have our config and then our debug. We'll have our config, then our player health. And now if we come down to our handle room transition, we can update to use our new properties. So we'll have our config. We'll have our room transition, player into next room, duration. I'm just going to copy that. Now we want this to be our delay. Let's go up to our other player tween. We'll replace our duration. So now we'll do our room transition, our player into hall duration. I'm going to copy that. Now we'll do our delay. And now for our camera, we'll get rid of our duration. And so we'll do our room transition, camera, animation, duration. Now we'll do our delay. All right, so let's save and we'll do a quick test. Let's have our player come down to our door. As soon as they interact with it, our camera and our player should be updated and transition to our next room. That's it for this part of the series. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. And if you're following along, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. If you have any questions or want to share your progress, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Alright, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.